The morning fog settles over Bucharest in winter like a shroud, clinging to the wide boulevards and turning streetlights into dim halos. The air carries the particular cold of Eastern Europe, the kind that penetrates wool and brick alike, that makes the bones ache. In this half-light, before the city fully wakes, one structure emerges from the mist with such deliberate enormity that it seems less built than imposed upon the landscape. 12 stories visible above ground, 4 concealed below. 3 million cubic meters of volume, 4,000 chandeliers, 1 million cubic meters of marble, 700,000 tons of steel and bronze. The numbers pile up like geological layers, each figure representing not just material, but human decision, human labor, human cost. The palace of the parliament rises from the center of Bucharest with the weight of a mountain range. To stand before it is to experience architecture as dominance, as an assertion so complete that it silences conversation. The facade stretches over 270 meters, the wings extending outward as if to embrace or engulf. 800 rooms in total, though no one has ever counted with absolute certainty. The building was designed to be incompletable, to always hold the possibility of expansion, to never reach a final form. This was intentional. A monument that could be finished might suggest limitation, and limitation was antithetical to the vision of the man who conceived it. But monuments do not pay their own heating bills. Beauty does not clean its own windows. Grandeur requires an army of invisible hands, a continuous transfusion of money and effort, a willingness to sacrifice present needs for the maintenance of past ambitions. The palace stands today not because it was built well, though it was built massively, but because successive generations chose to bear its weight rather than let it crumble. This choice was never simple, never obvious, and never without cost. To understand what this building demanded, we must return to the moment of its conception, to the mind of Nicolae Ceausescu on a March evening in 1977, when the earth beneath Bucharest shook for 56 seconds. The earthquake measured 7.4 on the Richter scale. 1,500 people died. 35,000 buildings sustained damage. Ceausescu, who had ruled Romania since 1965, stood among the rubble of apartment blocks and saw not tragedy, but opportunity. He had visited North Korea 3 years earlier and returned transfixed by Pyongyang's monumentalism. By the way, Kim Il-sung had carved a capital city into an instrument of power projection. The earthquake gave Ceausescu permission to rebuild Bucharest in his own image, to erase what he considered architecturally mediocre and ideologically suspect, to create a landscape that would testify to his vision long after his death. He was not an educated man in the conventional sense. Born in 1918 to peasant farmers in Skorny Chesht, a village of dirt roads and subsistence agriculture, Ceausescu left home at 11 to work in a Bucharest factory. His formal education ended in primary school. He joined the communist youth movement at 15, was imprisoned at 18 for anti-fascist activities, and spent his formative years in prisons and internment camps where the Romanian Communist Party educated its faithful in the doctrines of Marxist-Leninism. What he lacked in traditional learning, he compensated for with political instinct, ruthlessness, and an understanding of how to navigate the labyrinth of Communist Party hierarchies. By the time he took power in 1965, he had spent 34 years in the party machinery, learning how systems worked and how they could be bent. His wife Elena, daughter of a plowman, would later claim a doctorate in chemistry she did not earn and publish scientific papers she did not write. Together, they constructed a mythology of proletarian genius, of natural leaders elevated by revolutionary virtue rather than privilege. Ceausescu's charisma, such as it was, derived not from warmth, but from the appearance of incorruptible conviction. He spoke in declarative sentences. He rarely smiled. He cultivated the image of a man who had transcended personal desire to become pure will, pure ideology. And in the early years of his rule, before the megalomania fully metastasized, he enjoyed genuine popularity for defying Soviet dominance, for charting an independent foreign policy that won Romania favorable treatment from the West. But the earthquake changed him, or perhaps revealed what had always been latent. He began to speak of Bucharest as a city of bourgeois decadence, of architecture that reflected capitalist mediocrity rather than socialist grandeur. The historic center, with its Belle Epoque mansions and Orthodox churches, its narrow streets and human scale, offended him. He envisioned broad avenues modeled on the Champs-Élysées, monumental buildings that would dwarf anything in Moscow or Washington, a capital that would announce Romania's arrival as a power of the first rank. And at the heart of this new Bucharest would stand a palace unlike any other, a structure so vast that it would redefine what architecture could be. The planning began in 1978. Ceausescu summoned Anca Petrescu, a 28-year-old architect, and instructed her to design a building that would house all branches of government, all ministries, all party functions under one roof. It would contain assembly halls, ceremonial spaces, offices, residences, bunkers, secret tunnels, and facilities for functions not yet conceived. It would be, in effect, a city within a city, a self-contained universe of power. Petrescu, trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition with its emphasis on symmetry and classical forms, produced a design that borrowed from neoclassicism, Art Deco, and Soviet gigantism, while remaining distinctly Romanian in its use of domestic materials and decorative motifs. Every element would be sourced from within Romania's borders. Every chandelier would be Romanian crystal. Every textile would be Romanian wool. Every piece of marble would be cut from Romanian quarries. This was not merely nationalism, but a demonstration of autarky, of the regime's claim to total self-sufficiency. Construction began in earnest in 1984, and from the beginning it operated on a scale that defied normal logistics. The chosen site, Dealul Arsenalului, was not empty land but a living neighborhood. Uranus, Antim, Rahova, the old Jewish quarter, streets that had existed for centuries with their own networks of family, commerce, memory. 700 hectares were designated for demolition, though the final destruction would claim less but still be catastrophic. 19 Orthodox churches, 6 synagogues, 3 Protestant churches, 30,000 residences. 40,000 families received eviction notices. They were given days, sometimes hours, to gather belongings and relocate to prefabricated apartments on the city's periphery. No compensation beyond a new allocation, no legal recourse, no public debate. The demolition crews worked with systematic efficiency. Buildings came down in clouds of dust that hung over Bucharest for months. Entire streets vanished in days. Some churches were moved, literally disassembled and reconstructed elsewhere, a technical marvel undertaken to give the regime a veneer of cultural sensitivity while the destruction continued. Most were simply erased. The earth was leveled, then excavated. The foundation alone required the removal of 1 million cubic meters of soil. Workers dug 4 stories down, creating underground spaces for archives, storage, nuclear bunkers, mechanical systems, a subterranean city invisible from above but essential to the building's function. 20,000 workers labored on the construction at peak periods, divided into shifts that ran 24 hours a day. Many were soldiers from the Romanian army, assigned to construction brigades as a form of conscripted service. Others were civilians recruited from across the country, skilled craftsmen and unskilled laborers alike, promised higher wages than they could earn in their home villages. The wage premium was real but modest, and the conditions were brutal. Workers slept in barracks near the site, ate in communal canteens, labored in summer heat that turned the construction zone into an oven, and winter cold that froze mortar before it could set. Safety regulations existed on paper but were rarely enforced. Accidents were frequent. The exact number of deaths remains unknown because records were either never kept or were destroyed. Estimates range from dozens to hundreds, a margin of uncertainty that itself speaks to how little individual lives mattered in the calculus of the project. The materials arrived in continuous processions. Marble from Rushitsa, white and luminous, cut into slabs that required teams of men to maneuver. Oak and walnut from Transylvania's forests, old-growth timber felled specifically for parquet floors and paneling. Crystal from the Bistritsa region, melted and formed into chandeliers, some weighing over 2 tons. The logistics of transporting these materials across a country with inadequate roads and aging rail infrastructure constituted a second construction project, one rarely acknowledged but essential. Factories retooled to produce bronze fixtures and steel beams. Quarries expanded operations. Entire supply chains reoriented toward feeding the palace's insatiable appetite for materials. And because all of this occurred within a command economy already struggling with shortages, the palace's demands meant less for everything else. Hospitals went without supplies, schools made do with outdated equipment, consumer goods vanished from stores. The palace consumed resources the way a forest fire consumes oxygen, leaving depletion in its wake. Ceausescu visited the site constantly, sometimes daily, arriving without warning to inspect progress and issue new directives. He demanded changes to dimensions, to decorative details, to room configurations. Entire sections, already built, were demolished and reconstructed to accommodate his revisions. He insisted on a particular shade of white for the marble, rejecting loads that failed to meet his standard. He required that chandeliers hang at specific heights, that doors align perfectly across vast corridors, that symmetry be absolute. His micromanagement turned the project into a nightmare of rework and waste. Architects and engineers learned to pad their schedules and budgets, knowing that Ceausescu's interventions would add months and millions to any plan. But no one dared suggest scaling back. The palace had become inseparable from Ceausescu's identity, from his sense of historical destiny. To question the building was to question the leader, and in Ceausescu's Romania, that was not survivable. The building's scale defied human comprehension even as it took shape. The main assembly hall, intended for Communist Party congresses and state ceremonies, measured 76 meters in length, 36 meters in width, 16 meters in height. The ceiling weighed 600 tons, suspended on bronze and steel trusses. 4,000 chandeliers were not an exaggeration, but a precise count. Each one unique, each requiring installation by specialized craftsmen working from scaffolding. The grand staircase leading to the central balcony was carved from single pieces of marble, each step weighing hundreds of kilograms. The balcony itself, designed for Ceausescu to address crowds assembled on the boulevard of the victory of socialism, extended outward like a stage, a literal platform for the performance of power. But behind the marble facades and bronze doors lay the infrastructure that made the building function, and this infrastructure was simultaneously sophisticated and fragile. The heating system required its own small power plant, burning fuel oil to generate steam that traveled through kilometers of pipes to radiators distributed across 800 rooms. In winter, the building consumed fuel at a rate that would supply a small town. The electrical system, designed to support everything from lighting to the massive ventilators required for underground spaces, drew power from Bucharest's grid at levels that caused brownouts in surrounding neighborhoods during peak construction. Water and sewage systems had to be engineered to handle not just toilets and sinks, but ornamental fountains, climate control systems, and the possibility of thousands of people occupying the building simultaneously. All of this was concealed beneath floors and behind walls, invisible to anyone walking the ceremonial spaces, but constituting the majority of the building's operational complexity. The construction continued through the 1980s as Romania's economy collapsed. Ceausescu's policies, a combination of Stalinist central planning and his own idiosyncratic obsessions, had driven the country into debt during the 1970s. Rather than reform, he chose austerity, exporting food and fuel to repay foreign loans while Romanians endured rationing, power cuts, and cold apartments. The palace rose in the middle of this suffering, lit and heated, while citizens shivered, a daily accusation in stone and marble. The regime controlled media tightly enough that direct criticism was impossible, but the palace needed no commentary. Its existence was its own indictment, visible from miles away, a monument to priorities that valued grandeur over human welfare. By December 1989, the building was perhaps 70% complete. The exterior stood finished, the grand halls were operational, but hundreds of rooms remained unfinished, their walls bare concrete, their floors unpolished. And then the regime collapsed with startling speed. Protests in Timișoara spread to Bucharest, the army defected. Ceausescu and Elena fled the capital by helicopter on December 22nd, were captured, subjected to a hasty trial, and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. The palace, suddenly orphaned, stood as the most visible symbol of the dictatorship's excess, a building so associated with Ceausescu that some called for its demolition. The debate raged for months. Activists argued that the palace represented everything wrong with the old regime and should be destroyed as an act of cleansing. Pragmatists countered that demolition would waste the resources already invested and leave a massive void in the center of Bucharest. Architects pointed out that whatever its origins, the building was an extraordinary technical achievement, one of the largest structures on Earth, and that its destruction would be architectural vandalism. The economic argument ultimately prevailed, though it was close. Romania in the early 1990s was impoverished, its infrastructure crumbling, its economy in free fall as it transitioned from communism to a market system it did not yet understand. The palace, despite its enormous operating costs, at least existed. It could be repurposed, rented out, made to serve the new democracy rather than the old dictatorship. The new government moved into portions of the building in 1994, renaming it the Palace of the Parliament and designating it as the seat of both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. The symbolic weight of this decision was immense. Romania's new democracy would operate from within the monument, built by the dictatorship it had overthrown, transforming the palace from a symbol of oppression into a symbol of continuity and resilience. But symbolism did not pay for heating. The building's operational costs were immediately catastrophic. The heating bill alone exceeded the annual budget of some government ministries. Electricity costs ran into millions. A permanent staff of hundreds was required just for basic maintenance, cleaning, security, and technical operations. The government owned a building it could barely afford to keep lit. Solutions came slowly and incompletely. Portions of the building were leased to private entities, office space for businesses willing to pay premium rates for the prestige of a palace address. Conference facilities were rented for corporate events, weddings, exhibitions. A museum opened to explain the building's history, charging admission to tourists drawn by the combination of architectural ambition and dark historical associations. These measures generated revenue, but nowhere near enough to cover costs. The palace became a permanent line item in the national budget, an expense that could not be eliminated because abandoning the building was unthinkable, but that strained resources every fiscal year. The maintenance challenges were existential. A building of this scale has no small problems. When the roof developed leaks in the late 1990s, the repair project took years and cost millions. The marble floors, subjected to decades of foot traffic, required periodic refinishing, a process that meant closing sections of the building for months. The chandeliers, extraordinary pieces of craftsmanship, required specialized cleaning and repair, work that could only be done by a handful of artisans trained in techniques that were no longer taught. The heating and electrical systems, installed in the 1980s with equipment already outdated, began to fail with increasing frequency. Replacing components meant navigating a building so complex that even the maintenance staff did not fully understand all of its systems. Blueprints existed, but were often inaccurate, reflecting Ceausescu's last-minute changes that were implemented but never documented. The human cost of maintaining the palace extended beyond salaries. The permanent staff, numbering around 500 at any given time, worked in a building that was simultaneously a workplace and a monument, a living museum, and a functioning government facility. Security personnel patrolled corridors so long that a single round could take half an hour. Cleaners worked in teams, moving through vast halls with industrial equipment, their labor invisible to the parliamentarians and tourists who occupied the spaces they cleaned. Electricians and plumbers maintained systems they had not installed, troubleshooting failures in infrastructure buried behind marble walls. For these workers, the palace was not a symbol, but a job, one that paid modestly and demanded constant attention. The financial pressure intensified through the 2000s as Romania prepared for European Union accession. EU membership required conforming to building codes, accessibility standards, environmental regulations, all of which demanded expensive retrofitting. The palace, built without regard for energy efficiency, became a test case in how to modernize a building designed for a different era's priorities. Insulation was added where possible, though the building's mass made significant thermal improvements difficult. Modern HVAC systems were installed in some sections, though the cost of upgrading the entire structure remained prohibitive. Elevators were refurbished to meet safety standards, a project complicated by the fact that some of the palace's elevators were custom-built and replacement parts no longer existed. Through all of this, the building continued to function. Parliament met in the Assembly Hall, conducting the business of democracy in a space built for totalitarian spectacle. The incongruity was never resolved, only accepted. Legislators debated in rooms where Ceausescu had imagined eternal communist rule, their arguments echoing off marble walls indifferent to ideology. The building imposed its own logic on those who occupied it, its scale diminishing individual presence, its acoustics turning normal conversation into whispers and shouted speeches into echoes. Some parliamentarians reported feeling oppressed by the architecture, dwarfed by spaces designed to make humans feel small. Others grew accustomed, treating the palace as simply their workplace, extraordinary only in square footage. The global financial crisis of 2008 brought renewed questions about the palace's viability. Romania's economy contracted sharply. Austerity measures cut government budgets across the board. The palace's operating costs, still measured in millions annually, came under intense scrutiny. Proposals emerged to privatize sections of the building, to sell off wings to developers who might convert them into hotels or luxury apartments. The idea horrified preservationists and historians who argued that the palace's integrity depended on maintaining it as a coherent whole. But the economic logic was undeniable. An empty room in the palace cost money to heat and light. A room generating revenue at least offset some expenses. The compromise reached allowed limited commercialization while preserving the building's primary function as the seat of parliament. A luxury hotel was proposed but never built. Conference facilities expanded, marketed aggressively to international organizations and corporations. The museum improved its offerings, adding exhibits about the communist era and the building's construction, curating a narrative that acknowledged the palace's dark history while emphasizing its current role. Tourism grew, slowly at first, then steadily as Bucharest emerged as a destination for travelers interested in 20th-century history and architecture. The palace became Romania's most visited tourist attraction, a distinction both proud and uncomfortable. People came to see the monument built by a dictator who starved his people, to marvel at its excess while learning about the cost. The tours, conducted in multiple languages, followed a careful script. Guides explained the palace's dimensions, its materials, its construction process. They acknowledged the forced labor, the demolished neighborhoods, the resources diverted from essential needs. They described Ceausescu's megalomania without dwelling on the individual suffering it caused, maintaining a tone of historical explanation rather than moral judgment. The script was calibrated to inform without alienating, to acknowledge tragedy without becoming maudlin. Tourists photographed the grand staircase, the assembly hall, the chandeliers. They marveled at the marble and expressed astonishment at the scale. Most left impressed by the ambition and troubled by the human cost, exactly the reaction the museum intended. But tourism revenue, while helpful, remained a fraction of operating costs. The palace in the 2010s consumed approximately €6 million annually in basic operations, not counting major repairs or capital improvements. Parliament's budget covered most of this, but the building's appetite was insatiable. Energy costs alone approached €2 million, despite efforts to improve efficiency. A building with 3 million cubic meters of volume cannot be heated cheaply, especially when that volume is distributed across 12 stories above ground and 4 below, each with different thermal characteristics and usage patterns. The underground levels, necessary for storage and infrastructure, were particularly expensive to maintain, requiring constant dehumidification to prevent mold and structural degradation. The question of what to do with unoccupied space remained unresolved. Hundreds of rooms stood empty, some never finished, others completed, but unused. These rooms still required basic maintenance, still needed heating in winter to prevent pipes from freezing, still accumulated dust that had to be cleaned periodically. Proposals to finish the uncompleted sections were rejected as too expensive. Proposals to simply seal them off were rejected as potentially damaging to the building's structural integrity and climate control systems. The palace, designed to be filled with the apparatus of totalitarian government, had no natural use in a democracy that governed with smaller bureaucracies and less centralization. The building's scale, once a symbol of the regime's power, became a practical problem with no elegant solution. Conservation emerged as both a priority and a challenge. The palace, for all its faults, represented a unique moment in architectural history, the last gasp of totalitarian monumentalism before the Cold War ended. Historians and architects argued that it should be preserved not despite its association with dictatorship, but because of it, maintained as a testament to what unchecked power produces when architecture becomes ideology. The Romanian government designated the palace a historical monument in 2004, a decision that protected it from demolition or radical alteration, but also imposed strict requirements on how it could be modified. Any change to the building's exterior or significant interior spaces required approval from preservation authorities, adding bureaucratic complexity to already difficult maintenance decisions. The preservation mandate created its own tensions. Modern accessibility standards required elevators and ramps, modifications that were architecturally sensitive, but sometimes conflicted with the building's original design. Fire safety regulations demanded sprinkler systems and emergency exits, infrastructure that had to be integrated without disrupting the decorative program. Energy efficiency improvements required updating mechanical systems designed in the 1980s, work that often meant cutting through walls or floors to access buried infrastructure. Each project became a negotiation between competing values: preservation versus modernization, historical integrity versus practical necessity, aesthetic purity versus functional improvement. The craftsmen who maintained the palace faced particular challenges. The chandeliers, numbering in the thousands, required periodic cleaning and repair, work that demanded specialized knowledge of crystal work and metal casting. Many of the original craftsmen had retired or died, taking their expertise with them. Training new artisans required time and funding that were rarely available. The marble floors, subjected to decades of wear, developed cracks and stains that required repair techniques specific to the type of marble used, each quarry producing stone with slightly different characteristics. The oak and walnut paneling, beautiful but temperamental, warped in response to humidity changes, requiring constant monitoring and occasional replacement. Every repair became a small research project, an investigation into materials and techniques that were common in the 1980s but obscure today. The palace's relationship with Bucharest remained complicated. The building dominated the city's skyline and urban fabric, its presence inescapable. The Boulevard of the Victory of Socialism, renamed Union Boulevard after 1989, ran 2 miles from the palace to the city center, a ceremonial axis that severed neighborhoods and disrupted organic street patterns. The housing blocks built along the boulevard to frame Ceausescu's processions stood as secondary monuments to the era, brutalist structures that few loved, but that had become part of the city's identity. Urban planners debated for decades how to integrate the palace into a vision of Bucharest that was not defined by communist-era planning, but the building's scale made integration nearly impossible. The palace did not fit into Bucharest. Bucharest had been forced to accommodate the palace, and the scars of that accommodation remained visible. Efforts to activate the space around the palace met mixed success. The vast plaza in front of the building, designed for military parades and mass rallies, stood mostly empty in the democratic era, too large for normal public use, but occasionally hosting concerts and protests. The plaza's emptiness was itself expressive, a void that spoke to the gap between the building's intended purpose and its actual function. Attempts to program the space with markets, festivals, and public art installations enjoyed temporary success, but could not fully animate a landscape designed for spectacle rather than community. The palace created its own microclimate, both literal and figurative, a zone of altered reality where normal urban rules did not quite apply. The palace's future remains uncertain in ways both practical and philosophical. The building will require major structural interventions within the next few decades, work that will cost tens of millions of euros. The heating and electrical systems, already operating beyond their intended lifespan, will need complete replacement at costs that current budgets cannot accommodate. The marble cladding, subjected to decades of pollution and weather, shows signs of deterioration that will eventually require extensive remediation. These are not hypothetical problems, but certainties, maintenance obligations that cannot be deferred indefinitely without risking the building's integrity. Romania's government has explored various funding mechanisms. EU structural funds have supported some preservation projects, though securing grants requires navigating bureaucratic processes that move slowly and impose strict conditions. Public-private partnerships have been proposed, with private developers covering restoration costs in exchange for long-term leases on portions of the building. But these proposals raise questions about commercializing a national monument. International organizations have expressed interest in the palace as a conference venue, and some revenue has been generated this way, but not enough to fundamentally alter the economic equation. The palace remains what it has always been, a building too expensive to maintain and too significant to abandon. The irony is that the palace has become essential to Romanian national identity precisely because of its troubling history. The building represents both the worst of the communist era and Romania's determination to move beyond that era without erasing it. To maintain the palace is to accept responsibility for the past, to refuse the easy solution of demolition and historical amnesia. This acceptance has been neither simple nor universal. Debates about the palace recur whenever budgets tighten or preservation costs spike, and each time the question is fundamentally the same. Does this building deserve the resources it demands, or would Romania be better served by letting it decline? Those who argue for continued investment make several points. The palace is an architectural singularity, one of the largest buildings on Earth and a unique example of late communist monumentalism. Its loss would impoverish global architectural heritage regardless of the moral failings of its creator. The building also represents an extraordinary concentration of Romanian craftsmanship and materials, a demonstration of what the country's workers and resources could achieve even under oppressive conditions. To abandon the palace would be to devalue that labor, to suggest that the work of those who built it was worthless because it served an evil regime. Finally, the palace has become an economic asset through tourism and rental income. And while these revenues do not cover operating costs, they represent real money that would be lost if the building were closed. Those who argue against continued investment are equally compelling. The palace consumes resources that could fund schools, hospitals, infrastructure, all needs that remain urgent in Romania. The building's association with Ceausescu taints it, making it less a symbol of resilience than a reminder of trauma. The preservation mandate locks Romania into perpetual maintenance of a monument to dictatorship, forcing each generation to pay for decisions made by an oppressive regime. And the practical reality is that the building's scale makes sustainable operation nearly impossible. Without a fundamental change in how the palace is funded and used, it will remain a drain on the national budget indefinitely. The debate has no clear resolution because it involves incommensurable values. Economic efficiency cannot be weighed against historical preservation on the same scale. National pride cannot be quantified in euros. The palace forces Romania to make choices that reveal what the country values, and those values are not unanimous. What is clear is that the building's survival has never been inevitable. It endures because specific people made specific decisions to maintain it, often at personal and political cost, decisions that could have gone differently. The workers who keep the palace running rarely appear in discussions about its significance, but they are the ones who ensure its continued existence. The maintenance staff, the cleaners, the security personnel, the technicians who repair broken systems in the middle of the night, these people perform the unglamorous labor that monuments require. Their work is not ideological but practical, not about preserving history, but about keeping systems functional. When a heating pipe bursts in December, the question is not whether Ceausescu's vision deserves preservation, but whether Parliament will have heat for tomorrow's session. When a chandelier's wiring fails, the concern is not architectural heritage, but fire safety. The palace survives because these people show up day after day to perform tasks that will never be finished, maintaining a building that will always need more work. This labor, invisible to tourists and often overlooked by policymakers, represents the true cost of monumentalism. The palace's construction consumed lives, displaced families, diverted resources from essential needs. Its maintenance continues that consumption in less dramatic but equally real ways. Every euro spent on marble restoration is a euro not spent on education, Every hour a skilled technician devotes to the palace's antique elevators is an hour unavailable for other infrastructure. The trade-offs are constant and unavoidable, the price of maintaining beauty that was never meant to be sustainable. The philosophical question the palace poses is whether beauty created through suffering retains moral worth. The building is undeniably impressive, a demonstration of what human beings can achieve when resources and labor are marshaled toward a single purpose. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The materials are superb. The scale is awe-inspiring. But these achievements were purchased with displacement, deprivation, and death. Does the quality of the result redeem the brutality of the process, or does the brutality taint the result permanently? The question has no single answer, because it depends on what we believe monuments are for. If they exist to inspire and impress, the palace succeeds. If they exist to reflect a society's values, the palace is a catastrophic failure that inadvertently succeeded by revealing exactly what values produced it. What is certain is that the palace will not maintain itself. Its marble will not naturally repel stains. Its chandeliers will not spontaneously repair their wiring. Its heating systems will not upgrade themselves to modern efficiency standards. Every aspect of the building's continued existence depends on human decisions to allocate resources, to prioritize preservation over other needs, to accept the ongoing cost of maintaining a monument whose creator is universally condemned. These decisions are made yearly in budget negotiations, monthly in maintenance schedules, daily in the choices of workers who could find easier jobs elsewhere, but choose to remain. The Palace of the Parliament, as it stands today, represents a compromise with history. It is neither fully embraced nor rejected, neither celebrated nor demolished, neither adequately funded nor allowed to decay. It exists in a state of permanent tension, maintained well enough to function, but not well enough to resolve its underlying problems, preserved well enough to survive, but not well enough to thrive. This state of tension may be the most honest relationship Romania can have with the building, accepting it as part of the national patrimony, while refusing to glorify the vision that produced it. The central question, who truly paid for this dream, has multiple answers depending on when the question is asked. Initially, the cost was borne by the 40,000 families evicted from demolished neighborhoods, by the workers who labored in dangerous conditions, by the Romanian people who endured shortages so that marble could be transported and crystal chandeliers could be hung. After 1989, the cost shifted to Romanian taxpayers who fund the building's operations through their contributions to the national budget. But the cost also extends into the future, to the generations who will inherit the responsibility of maintaining or disposing of this monument, who will make their own choices about whether the palace deserves preservation. What it costs to keep the palace alive today can be quantified in euros, in millions spent annually on operations, and tens of millions needed for long-term structural work. But the cost can also be measured in opportunity, in what else those resources might have funded, in the alternative futures that were foreclosed by the decision to maintain the building. And there is a psychological cost, the burden of living with a monument to dictatorship at the center of the capital, a daily reminder of a past that cannot be undone, but can only be remembered and, perhaps, transcended. The palace will likely outlast the regime that built it by centuries. Dictatorships are temporary, but architecture, if maintained, persists. The building's eventual fate is uncertain. Future generations may find ways to fully integrate it into democratic life, may discover uses that justify its scale and cost, or they may decide that the burden is too great, that the resources required could be better deployed elsewhere, that preservation has limits. What is unlikely is that the building will simply be forgotten or ignored. Its presence is too commanding, its history too significant, its maintenance too demanding. The lesson the palace teaches is that monuments outlive their creators but inherit their debts. Every grand vision requires infrastructure, maintenance, daily labor, financial resources, all the unglamorous work that keeps beauty from decaying into ruin. Ceausescu imagined a building that would testify to his greatness for millennia, but he did not imagine or did not care what that testimony would cost once he was gone. He assumed the future would accept the burden he imposed, would honor his vision by maintaining his monument. Instead, the future accepted the burden while rejecting the vision, maintaining the building despite rather than because of what it represents. The Palace of the Parliament stands today not as Ceausescu intended, as a monument to socialist achievement and personal glory, but as something more complicated and more honest, a monument to the limits of power, the persistence of consequences, and the price of beauty. It survives because people choose, continually and not unanimously, to pay that price. This choice is made not once but repeatedly, in every budget allocation, every maintenance decision, every repair project. The building's future depends on whether those choices continue, whether future generations find value in preserving this troubling monument or decide that some debts should not be honored. The cost of maintaining the palace is not only financial, but existential. It requires acknowledging that history cannot be undone, that the past imposes obligations on the present, that beauty and brutality can coexist in the same structure. It requires accepting that there are no perfect solutions, that every choice involves trade-offs, that preserving architectural heritage sometimes means preserving monuments to systems we condemn. The palace forces these confrontations, refuses to let them be resolved easily or abstractly, insists on making them concrete in annual budgets and daily labor. The beauty of the palace is undeniable when you stand in the Grand Assembly Hall and look up at the 600-ton ceiling suspended above you, when light refracts through crystal chandeliers, when marble columns rise like a forest of stone. But that beauty does not exist independently of its cost. The marble was quarried by workers earning minimal wages in difficult conditions. The chandeliers were assembled in factories that produced little else, diverting skilled labor from other needs. The ceiling was engineered and installed by people who had no choice but to participate in the project, who could not refuse without personal consequence. The beauty and the suffering are inseparable, woven into the same fabric, impossible to disentangle. To visit the palace today as a tourist is to participate in this complicated legacy. The admission fee helps fund maintenance, contributing to the building's preservation. The visit acknowledges the palace's significance, validates the decision to maintain it. But the visit also confronts you with the scale of the ambition and the cost it required, forces you to consider what you think monuments are for and whether this one deserves to endure. The museum's exhibits provide information but cannot resolve these questions. They remain open, personal, dependent on what values you bring to the encounter. The palace's staff, those who work there daily, develop their own relationships with the building that transcend tourism and politics. For them, the palace is a workplace with unusually high ceilings and exceptionally long hallways, a place where they earn their living and take professional pride in their work. The cleaners take pride in the shine of the marble. The electricians take pride in keeping ancient systems functional. The tour guides take pride in conveying the palace's history accurately and compellingly. Their labor is not symbolic but real. Not about historical memory, but about daily tasks performed with competence. Yet their work sustains the monument, makes its continued existence possible, bridges the gap between the palace's symbol and the palace's functioning building. The fundamental truth the palace embodies is that great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. Appreciation is passive, but survival requires active effort, continuous investment, daily labor. A building, no matter how grand, is only as permanent as the commitment to maintain it. Without heat, the palace would freeze. Without electricity, it would go dark. Without cleaning, it would accumulate grime. Without repairs, it would deteriorate. The monument exists in a state of controlled decay, perpetually aging but perpetually maintained, never fully complete, but never allowed to collapse. This precarious balance between entropy and preservation defines not just the palace but all monuments, all attempts to make beauty permanent in a world where nothing lasts without effort. The Palace of the Parliament will continue to demand choices. In 5 years, when the heating system requires major upgrades, Romania will decide whether to fund the work or accept reduced functionality. In 10 years, when the marble cladding needs extensive restoration, the government will decide whether preservation justifies the cost. In 20 years, when new accessibility and environmental standards require further retrofitting, a future generation will decide whether the building's historical significance outweighs the expense. Each decision will be contested. Each choice will involve sacrifice. Each commitment will require justifying why this building deserves resources that could serve other needs. The answer to who truly paid for this dream encompasses the dead and the living, the past and the present and the future. It includes the families evicted to clear the construction site, the workers who built the palace under difficult conditions, the citizens who endured shortages while resources flowed to the project. It includes the taxpayers who fund operations today, the maintenance workers who labor to keep systems functional, the future generations who will inherit the obligation to preserve or dispose of the monument. The cost is distributed across time, across populations, across categories of sacrifice that cannot be summed into a single figure. The dream was Ceausescu's, but the payment is collective, ongoing, inescapable. What it costs to keep the palace alive today is approximately €6 million annually in direct operational expenses, plus periodic capital projects that run into tens of millions. But beyond these figures lies a deeper cost, the opportunity cost of what else those resources might achieve, the psychological cost of maintaining a monument to dictatorship, the moral cost of preserving beauty born from suffering. These costs cannot be calculated precisely because they involve values that resist quantification, trade-offs that have no objectively correct resolution. The palace survives because enough people, enough of the time, decide that its preservation serves purposes that justify the cost, purposes that include historical memory, architectural heritage, national identity, economic benefit, and simple inertia, the difficulty of making the alternative decision. The palace will endure as long as these choices continue, as long as people commit resources and labor to its maintenance, as long as the value of preservation outweighs the burden of cost. This endurance is not guaranteed. It depends on economic conditions, political priorities, cultural values, all of which change. The building that seems permanent today could be abandoned tomorrow if circumstances shift, if resources become too scarce, if future generations decide that some monuments should be allowed to fall. The marble will crack, the chandeliers will tarnish, the systems will fail, unless human beings actively prevent these outcomes. The Palace of the Parliament stands as testimony to both human ambition and human limitation, to what we can build and what building costs, to the monuments we create and the debts we incur. It survives not because it is indestructible, but because it is maintained, not because it is universally loved, but because enough people find value in its preservation. The building's future is uncertain, dependent on choices not yet made, resources not yet allocated, labor not yet performed. What is certain is that beauty, Even beauty as overwhelming as the palaces requires service, demands sacrifice, lives only through the continuous effort of people willing to bear its weight. If you inherited a monument built through great suffering but representing extraordinary human achievement, would you choose to preserve it at the cost of resources needed for the living, or would you let it fall to honor those who paid its original price?